I've been counting for 37 years, though I'm no longer certain the numbers mean what they once did. Time functions differently when you're erased from the records, when your designation becomes a clerical error, when the Imperium, that vast and eternal machinery grinding across the galaxy, simply stops acknowledging your existence. I don't expect you to understand. How could you? You still have a name that appears in databases, a work assignment that generates documentation, a ration chit that someone, somewhere, processes. You are seen. You are counted. You matter, even if only as a single microscopic gear in the infinite mechanism. I was Sub-Administrator Tertius of Subsector Maritime Records, File Classification Division, Hive Praxis, when it happened. A middling position, neither prestigious nor shameful, exactly the kind of role the Imperium relies upon but never celebrates. My life was columns and data slates, verification stamps, and cross-referencing protocols. I worked in a chamber 700 meters below the Hive's principal commercial levels, in one of those endless bureaucratic warrens where the air tastes of recycled breath and old parchment, where the only sound is the scratching of styluses and the distant groan of ventilation systems that have been failing for centuries but never quite stop completely. The error started small, as these things always do. A quarterly personnel audit returned my identification number with a flag. Minor discrepancy, it said, requires secondary verification. Standard procedure. I submitted the documentation. The forms came back rejected. Wrong subsection code, they said. I checked my records. The codes were correct. They had been correct for 19 years. I resubmitted. Rejected again. By then, 3 other systems had begun questioning my existence. My habitation permit required revalidation. My food allocation wasn't processing. The genetic registry couldn't locate my bloodline verification. I remember standing in the central documentation office, a vast chamber of Gothic arches and cogitator banks, holding 17 different identification documents, each one properly sealed and stamped, each one supposedly proving I was who I claimed to be. The clerk, a woman whose face I can still see with perfect clarity, though I've forgotten almost everything else about those early days, looked at my papers with an expression of polite confusion. She ran them through the verification cogitator. It hummed, it clicked. It returned a flat null result. "There's no record of this designation," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind. That made it worse somehow. "You'll need to file a discrepancy report with Subsector Command." I filed the report. 6 months later, it was returned unprocessed. The reason code translated roughly to referent entity unconfirmed. They couldn't process my complaint about not existing because, according to their system, I didn't exist to file the complaint. The logic was perfect, circular, unbreakable. I began to understand then, though I didn't want to. I began to feel the shape of the trap closing. My supervisor stopped acknowledging my presence around month 8. Not deliberately, I don't think it was cruelty, though in the Imperium cruelty and procedure are often indistinguishable. He would look at my desk, at the space where I sat, and his eyes would move past me as if I were a shadow, a trick of the light. When I spoke, he would pause, frowning slightly, as if hearing an echo from an empty room. Other workers began exhibiting the same behavior. I would greet them in corridors, and they would walk through the space where I stood, not shoving me aside, but somehow occupying the same location without acknowledgement, as if I had become something that existed in a parallel dimension, visible but incorporable. My ration chit stopped working in month 11. I stood in the distribution line, you know the kind, stretching for hundreds of meters through the lower hive. Levels. Thousands of workers waiting silently for their daily allotment of protein paste and recycled water. And when I reached the dispensary window, the servitor's mechanical eyes tracked past me. Its feeding tube remained retracted. I waved my chit again. Nothing. The person behind me stepped forward, pushing through the space where I stood, and received their rations without incident. I tried 3 more distribution points that day. Same result. I realized I would need to steal food or starve, and the Imperium punishes theft with execution or servitorization. But how do you prosecute someone who doesn't exist? Would they even see me in the detention cell? I tested it. Small thefts at first. A protein bar from an unmanned vendor, water from a public fountain that should have required citizen verification. No alarms, no response. I escalated. Took a data slate from an administrative office, walked out past security checkpoints. The guard's eyes slid over me. I was learning the rules of my new existence. I could interact with physical objects, but the human systems that governed those objects couldn't register my interaction. I was a ghost in the machine, and the machine, the vast imperial apparatus, had grown too large to notice its own phantoms. The habitation block evicted me in month 14, though eviction implies acknowledgement. My door authorization simply stopped functioning. I stood outside my quarters for 2 hours, watching the access panel's dim red refusal light, before I understood that I would never enter that space again. My possessions, such as they were, a few changes of clothing, some personal data slates, a miniature icon of the God Emperor I had received upon completing my administrative certification, remained inside, sealed in a tomb I could see but never access. Someone else would move in eventually. They would find my things and dispose of them, never knowing they had belonged to someone, never questioning where the previous occupant had. Gone. I moved to the spaces between. Every hive has them. The forgotten corridors, the abandoned sections, the architectural gaps that emerge when a city grows for 10,000 years without coherent planning. I found a maintenance tunnel behind a sealed door in subsector 47 Gamma. The lock was broken, had been for decades probably. Inside, the air was 20 degrees colder than the inhabited sections, and the darkness was almost complete except for the occasional emergency illuminator that flickered with failing power. I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, and beneath that, the omnipresent rumble of the hive's deeper mechanisms, the geothermal processors and waste recyclers and ancient tech systems that no one alive understood anymore. I wasn't alone in the forgotten spaces. I discovered this after 3 months of living in the maintenance tunnel. There were others like me, perhaps 24 in total, scattered throughout the abandoned zones. Not all were clerical errors. Some had fled crimes, though how do you flee when you're nowhere? Others had been declared dead in paperwork mistakes, their actual living bodies inconvenient contradictions that the system couldn't reconcile. One woman, Marissa, she told me her name in a whisper, as if speaking it too loudly might alert the universe to her continued existence, had been a Medicaid nurse. Her entire hospital ward had been demolished in an industrial accident, and the casualty reports had listed all personnel as deceased. She survived, but the Imperium had already processed her death benefits, already reassigned her identification number, already moved forward. There was no mechanism for undoing death once it was administratively confirmed. We developed our own society in those spaces between. Rules, though unspoken. We shared food stolen from distribution centers, water siphoned from purification lines. We spoke in low voices, always conscious that our presence was an error the universe might suddenly correct with violence. Marisa taught me how to move through crowded spaces without triggering recognition, a kind of walking that kept you in peripheral vision, that exploited the way human attention filters out inconsistencies. People see what they expect to see, she explained. The Imperium trains citizens to notice deviation, but we're not deviation, we're absence. We're the blank space in the ledger. Their minds literally cannot process us. I tested her theory, walked into active administrative offices during work hours, sat at empty desks, watched the clerks and sub-administrators going about their duties, and not one of them registered my presence. I could read their documents over their shoulders, could listen to confidential Vox communications. I was the perfect spy, except I had no one to report to, no purpose for the secrets I accumulated. The information was meaningless. I learned that Hive Praxis was 7 months behind on its tithe obligations, that Subsector Command suspected heretical activity in the lower industrial levels, that water rations would be reduced by 15% in the coming quarter. None of it mattered. I was outside the system now, and the system's concerns no longer applied to me. The others had been forgotten for varying lengths of time. Marissa had endured 7 years, a man named Kalo, former enforcer, victim of a filing mistake during a precinct reorganization, had survived 11 years in the margins. The eldest among us was someone we called Old Jerick, though that likely wasn't his real name. He claimed to have been forgotten for 33 years, though his mind was fragmentary, his stories inconsistent. He spoke of a time before the current planetary governor, before the last 3 planetary governors, in fact. He had worked in waste management, he said, until a simple error in shift scheduling erased him from the duty rosters. He hadn't reported the mistake quickly enough, and by the time he tried to correct it, the window had closed. The system had moved on without him. Old Jerick frightened me, not because of anything he did, but because of what he represented, the long-term outcome of this condition. His hair had gone completely white, his teeth were mostly gone, his body was wasted, skeletal, though he had somehow survived decades on stolen scraps and contaminated water. But worse than the physical deterioration was the mental decay. He would forget mid-sentence what he was saying, would introduce himself to me multiple times in a single day, having no memory of our previous conversations. Sometimes he would stare at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if his sense of self had eroded along with his place in the Imperial records. I was watching my own future, and it was a slow dissolution into nothing. I tried to re-establish my existence in year 3, gathered every piece of documentation I still possessed, every proof of identity, every verification of service. I presented myself at the Administratum Central Processing Facility, a Gothic monstrosity of stone and steel that occupied 3 entire hive levels. I stood in the supplicants' line for 9 hours. When I finally reached the processing window, I spread my documents before the clerk, a different one this time, younger, with the same dull expression they all wore after decades of processing forms. I explained my situation, spoke clearly, calmly, presented each piece of evidence in turn. He looked at the documents, looked at me, looked at the documents again, called over a supervisor. They conferred in low voices. The supervisor examined my papers with a magnification lens, checking for forgery markers. Found none, because they weren't forgeries. They were authentic Imperial documents, properly sealed, correctly formatted. The problem wasn't their legitimacy. The problem was that they referenced an entity, me, that the system insisted didn't exist. The supervisor's face showed no emotion when he swept the documents back toward me and said, "These files reference a terminated designation. If you persist in this fraudulent claim, you will be reported to the Arbites for identity falsification." I left before they could summon enforcement. Understood then that there would be no appeal, no correction. The system, once it had made its error, could not acknowledge the error without acknowledging its own fallibility, and the Imperium does not admit fallibility. I was an impossibility, and impossibilities must be either ignored or eliminated. I chose to be ignored. The years began to blend. 4 became 5, became 7. I stopped counting birthdays, stopped tracking the passage of seasons. Time in the underhive is measured differently anyway, not by suns and moons, but by the cycling of shift changes, the rhythm of industrial processes, the periodic maintenance sweeps that forced us to relocate our hidden settlements. I learned the patterns, learned when the forgotten spaces were safest, when the Mechanicus tech adepts would descend for repairs and we would need to scatter like rats into deeper darkness. I became efficient at theft. Not proud of it, but efficiency replaced morality when survival became the only imperative. I could slip into a ration depot during shift change, when the distribution servitors were being recalibrated and the human overseers were distracted, could carry away enough protein paste and water reclamation tablets to sustain myself for weeks. The other forgotten helped when they could, though our society had no real cooperation, only parallel survival. We were too damaged, too eroded by our condition, to form genuine bonds. We shared space, but not trust. We traded information, but not friendship. We were each fundamentally alone, even when we stood together in our hidden chambers, speaking in whispers about the world that had deleted us. Marissa disappeared in year 9, simply wasn't in her usual sleeping alcove one morning. We searched the nearby sections, called her name softly into the darkness, found nothing. The others speculated, maybe she had tried to return to the surface, maybe she had fallen into one of the hive's many lethal gaps, unstabilized floors, exposed machinery, toxic chemical pools. Maybe she had been caught by an Arbeitspatrol and, unable to be processed, simply executed as an unidentifiable vagrant. Or maybe, and this was the theory that haunted me, maybe she had been forgotten so completely that she ceased to exist in any physical sense, that the universe itself had corrected its error by retroactively erasing her from reality. I knew that was irrational, but rationality becomes negotiable when you live in the margins of existence. Kalo went mad in year 12. I watched it happen gradually, then all at once. He began talking to people who weren't there, having conversations with Imperial officials who couldn't see him, arguing with supervisors from his former precinct posting. He would stand in populated areas during shift change, screaming his identification number, demanding to be acknowledged. Citizens would flow around him like water around a stone, their faces registering nothing. Eventually he stopped eating, stopped moving, sat in a corner of one of our shared spaces, staring at nothing, his lips moving silently. When he finally died, starvation or despair or simple surrender, we couldn't even give him proper rites. We just moved his body to one of the deeper refuse chutes and let the hive's recycling systems claim him. The God Emperor received all souls, the priests said, but I wondered if he could see a soul that no system acknowledged, that had been erased from every ledger and record. I began experiencing my own deterioration around year 15, not madness exactly, but a kind of loosening, a sense that the boundaries of myself were becoming negotiable. I would forget my own name for hours at a time, would lose track of whether I had eaten that day or that week. My reflection, in the rare bits of polished metal I encountered, became increasingly unfamiliar. My face was thinner, angular in ways I didn't remember. My hair had grayed early. My eyes had developed a distance, a flatness, as if the person behind them had withdrawn to some deeper interior space. The physical symptoms were manageable. Hunger became normal, a constant background sensation like the hum of machinery. The contaminated water gave me periodic illness, cramps, fever, hallucinations, but my body adapted, built resistance. The cold was harder. The forgotten spaces were poorly heated, and I had only the clothes I had been wearing when my habitation lock stopped recognizing me. I stole additional layers when possible, but clothing degrades, and I had neither the resources nor the access to replace things properly. By year 20, I was wearing a patchwork of stolen garments, each piece from a different source, none of it fitting correctly, all of it stained with the grime of places where humans weren't meant to live. But the psychological degradation was far worse. I found myself questioning basic facts of my existence. Had I ever really been Sub-Administrator Tertius? Had that life happened, or was it a false memory, a story I had constructed to make sense of my current condition? I had no documents anymore, lost during one of the emergency relocations when Arbeit swept through our section. No proof, no external validation, just my own increasingly unreliable memories. I remembered a supervisor named Ganth, but was he real? I remembered processing files about off-world tithe shipments, but did those shipments exist? The past became hypothetical, and without a past my present lost coherence. Old Jerick died in year 18. We found him in his sleeping space, already cold, his eyes open but seeing nothing. He had simply worn out, like a piece of machinery running past its operational lifespan. We performed the same ritual we had for Kalo, moved the body to the recyclers, whispered a brief prayer to the God Emperor, tried not to think too deeply about what it meant that even death couldn't give us dignity. I inherited his sleeping space, a small alcove behind a broken coolant exchanger. It was marginally warmer than where I'd been before. I tried to feel grateful but couldn't locate the emotion. Gratitude requires a sense of fortune, and fortune requires a framework of alternatives. I had none. New forgotten ones arrived occasionally, trickling into our hidden society. A woman named Hess appeared in year 22, fresh from the surface world, still in shock from her sudden transition into non-existence. She had been a HAB complex maintenance supervisor, she said. A merger of administrative sectors had resulted in duplicate staff assignments, and the resolution algorithm had simply deleted her designation rather than reassign her. She still had her work clothes, still smelled of industrial cleaner and honest sweat. I tried to help her acclimate, taught her what I had learned about movement and theft and survival. But I could see in her eyes the same look I must have had in my own 20 years earlier: disbelief, desperation, the frantic conviction that this mistake would be corrected soon, that someone would notice, that the system would self-repair. It never did. I watched her descend through the same stages I had experienced: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. She skipped acceptance. I don't think any of us truly accepted. We just stopped fighting. After 8 months, Hess stopped speaking. After 15 months, she stopped responding to her name. By year 24, she was functionally gone, still physically present but mentally evacuated. She wandered the forgotten spaces like a servitor without programming, performing random movements without purpose or pattern. Sometimes I would see her standing motionless in a corridor, staring at a wall for hours. Other times she would walk in perfect circles for entire shifts. The person she had been was gone. Only the body remained, and I suspected it wouldn't remain much longer. I began having extended periods of dissociation around year 25. I would wake up in places with no memory of traveling there, would find myself in sections of the underhive I had never intentionally visited, standing in front of machinery I didn't recognize, holding objects I didn't remember acquiring. Hours would pass, sometimes entire days, with no conscious memory of their passage. I was losing time, losing continuity. My mind was fragmenting, finding the burden of uninterrupted consciousness too heavy to maintain. During one of these fugue states, I somehow made it to the upper hive levels. I came to in a commercial district surrounded by functional citizens going about their business, purchasing goods, conducting transactions, living their acknowledged lives. I stood in the center of a crowded plaza, watching them. No one looked at me. A child ran directly through the space where I stood, chasing a rolling ball. A merchant stacked cargo containers in a neat pyramid, and his geometric precision required him to reach through my body to position one of the upper units. I felt the displacement of air, the slight warmth of his arm passing through my chest cavity, but no actual contact. I wasn't there. Not really. I was a probability ghost, an error in local reality that would eventually be corrected by entropy or divine will or simple statistical normalization. I don't remember how I returned to the forgotten spaces, time gap, another fugue, but I found myself back in my alcove, shaking with something between fear and excitement. I had seen the world, the real world, the acknowledged one, and I understood with complete clarity that I would never inhabit it again. The membrane between existence and non-existence was permeable in only one direction. You could fall out of the world, but you couldn't climb back in. Year 30 was marked by a near-catastrophic collapse of the section where most of us sheltered, a structural failure, something far above us, some piece of the hive's ancient foundation finally surrendering to gravity and age, sent debris cascading through multiple levels. The noise was apocalyptic, a grinding roar that seemed to emanate from the planet's core. We scattered in different directions, some didn't make it. I heard screaming that cut off abruptly, silenced by tons of falling stone and metal. When the collapse finished, hours later, or maybe days, time was especially fluid during crises, I found only 3 other forgotten ones still alive in what remained of our territory. An old man whose name I never learned, a young woman who might have been Hess but looked too different to be certain, and someone else whose gender and age I couldn't determine because they never removed the bundle of rags they wore as clothing and protection. We didn't rebuild our society, didn't attempt to. The 4 of us simply existed in parallel, occupying overlapping space, but lacking the energy or will for genuine interaction. We were winding down, reaching the natural conclusion of our impossible existence. I could feel it in my body, a deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't address, that food couldn't relieve. My cells were tired of the work of living. My nervous system was ready to power down. I had been forgotten for 30 years, and 30 years of not existing was apparently the limit of biological tolerance. The dreams began in year 35, or maybe they were hallucinations. The distinction became meaningless. I would see my old life with perfect clarity, my desk in the file classification division, the view from my habitation unit, the face of my supervisor Ganth. But these visions had a strange quality, like memories viewed through distorted glass. Details were wrong. My desk was made of wood instead of metal. My window looked out onto a landscape that didn't match any part of hive praxis. Ganth's face shifted, becoming younger, then older, then younger again, cycling through ages in random sequence. I began to suspect these weren't memories at all, but confabulations, narratives my mind was generating to fill the void where an actual past should have been. What if I had never been Sub-Administrator Tertius? What if that entire identity was a fiction, a story that had never been recorded because it had never happened? What if I was a spontaneous emergence, a quantum fluctuation in the hive's reality, a consciousness that came into being already forgotten, already erased? My entire past nothing but false pattern recognition creating meaning from random neural firing. I had no proof otherwise, no documentation, no witnesses, no records, just my own increasingly unreliable memory, and memory could be trusted least of all. I stopped eating in year 36. Not deliberately, there was no suicide decision, no moment of giving up. I just forgot that eating was necessary, would see food and not recognize it as relevant to my continued existence. The other remaining forgotten didn't notice or didn't care. We had moved beyond looking after each other. We were each isolated in our own dissolution, and whatever bonds had once connected us had long since eroded. The visions intensified. I saw the God Emperor, or something I interpreted as the God Emperor, though it looked nothing like the icons and images that filled every imperial space. This figure was vast, geometric, made of pure mathematical relations rather than flesh or light. It spoke in equations I almost understood, in variables that defined existence itself. It told me, or I understood it to mean, that I had been selected for a special purpose to demonstrate the Imperium's perfection, that even its errors were intentional, that every forgotten one was a necessary sacrifice, a soul given to prove the system's transcendent completeness. We were the negative space that defined the positive, the absence that gave meaning to presence. We were holy in our erasure. I don't think I believed this vision, but belief requires a self that can evaluate truth, and I was no longer certain I possessed such a self. The boundaries of my identity had grown so porous that external and internal became indistinguishable. The hive's machinery rhythms felt like my own heartbeat. The distant prayers of citizens in the populated levels sounded like my own thoughts. I was becoming diffuse, spreading out, losing the concentration of consciousness that defines an individual person. Year 37. I woke up, if waking is the right term, in a section I had never seen before, deeper than I had ever ventured. The walls here were ancient, pre-imperial, made of a material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air tasted of minerals and time. There was writing on the walls, symbols in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They said, "You are where you belong. This ice the place of what does not exist. Rest here." I sat down with my back against one of those dark walls. My body felt immensely heavy, as if gravity had suddenly tripled. Or perhaps my body had simply accumulated enough decades that its weight became unbearable. I closed my eyes, tried to remember my name, failed, tried to remember any name, failed, tried to remember what names were for, failed. Somewhere far above, the Imperium continued its eternal operations. Clerks processed forms, administrators verified documentation. Citizens received their rations and reported to their duties and spoke prayers to the God Emperor. The machinery of existence ground forward, magnificent and terrible, and utterly indifferent to the small errors it generated in its wake. A few designations lost here and there, a few souls misplaced, a few people who fell through the cracks in the system and just kept falling until they reached places like this, dark and silent and forgotten. I wonder sometimes, in the few moments when I can still assemble something resembling a coherent thought, whether anyone else is down here, whether the forgotten spaces extend infinitely downward, level after level of abandoned architecture filled with the ghosts of administrative errors, millions of us who were deleted from the ledgers and now occupy this parallel dimension where nothing is recorded and nothing is acknowledged, but everything still, somehow, continues to exist in its strange halfway state. I wonder if the God Emperor knows about us, if he watches from his golden throne and sees not only the counted trillions but also the uncounted forgotten, if there is a special mercy reserved for those who slip through even his vast attention, or if we simply fall until we hit some ultimate basement of reality where even existence itself gives up trying to accommodate us. The darkness here is very complete. The silence is very deep. I can no longer feel my body with any certainty, can no longer distinguish between internal and external sensation. I'm no longer sure whether these thoughts are occurring in real time, or if they are memories of thoughts I had at some previous point, or anticipations of thoughts I will have at some future point, or if time itself has become as negotiable as everything else in this place, where the forgotten come to finish forgetting even themselves. There is a certain peace in it, I think, or maybe I'm just so exhausted that exhaustion feels like peace. The struggle to exist was so long, and the struggle to be acknowledged was even longer, and now that both struggles are ending, there is a kind of relief. The universe is correct after all. I don't exist. Never did, perhaps. Was only ever a glitch, a momentary pattern in the noise, and now the noise is reclaiming me and returning me to the proper state of absolute absence. I had a name once. I remember that much. It meant something to someone, or to me at least, or perhaps not even that. Perhaps it was just a designation, a reference code, as arbitrary and meaningless as all the other numbers and words that the Imperium uses to catalogue its infinite components. And when that designation was deleted, when that name ceased to appear in any record or database or human memory, did I cease as well? Or did some essential me persist, some ghost of consciousness that continued long after the formal documentation ended? I don't know. I'm not sure I ever knew. I'm not sure knowledge is possible when your existence itself is a question mark, when reality refuses to confirm your presence, when you live in the spaces that officially don't exist and therefore everything you experience must also, by definition, not exist. The God Emperor protects, they say. But who protects those the God Emperor cannot see? Who watches over the unwatched? Who remembers the forgotten? No one. That's the answer. No one at all. And that's all right. It's all right. It has to be all right because there is no alternative, because this is where the falling ends, in this deep darkness where the last traces of me are finally dissolving, where even the concept of me becomes too difficult to maintain, where the boundaries between self and void become impossible to distinguish and eventually cease to matter. I was someone once, I think, I believe, I remember, or maybe I just imagine that I remember, that imagination and memory have become so interchangeable that there is no practical difference, that my entire existence, past, present, and the small sliver of future I have left, is nothing but a story I'm telling myself in this final moment, a narrative constructed to give meaning to the darkness, to make sense of the senseless, to pretend that erasure is experience. They forgot me. The Imperium forgot me. The system moved on without me. And now I'm forgetting myself, and that seems right somehow, seems symmetrical and appropriate and just. If the universe doesn't acknowledge you, perhaps the proper response is to stop acknowledging yourself. Perhaps that's the final mercy, the last kindness, that you can forget your own forgetting, can release even the memory of having been forgotten, can dissolve so completely that there is no longer anyone left to mourn the loss. I had a name, had a number, had a designation, had a purpose, had a life, I think, maybe, once. The darkness is very patient. It has been waiting 37 years for me to finally accept its invitation. I'm accepting now. I'm letting go. I'm allowing the dissolution to complete. I'm becoming what the records always said I was, nothing, nothing at all. Just empty space where a person used to be, or perhaps never was, or perhaps was only ever an error that is finally being corrected by the universe's vast autocorrect function. The Imperium is perfect. All its actions are just. All its operations are necessary. If I was erased, then my erasure was correct. If I was forgotten, then I deserved forgetting. The system cannot be wrong. Therefore I must have been the error. Therefore my removal was proper and just. Therefore this ending is exactly what should happen. I believe this. I have to believe this. Belief is the only thing left. The God Emperor protects. Even from himself, even from his own forgotten ones, even from those who fall through the cracks in his protection. Even from me, even from whatever I was, even from whatever I am becoming, even from this, even from even,